Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jessica Swale's play, Blue Stockings. Now, some of you may know, I love history plays. I've talked about this before on the channel. Actually, I recently did a video on Jessica Swale's play, Nell Gwyn, and I talked about my love of history plays. I also, as a professional educator working in the university, love campus novels, plays, stuff like this. I love education-oriented literature. And so Blue Stockings combines both of them. Basically, this is a play about the early days of Girton College, which was founded initially about 20 miles from Cambridge, and then they subsequently moved much closer to Cambridge. And basically, this was the sort of women's equivalent of Cambridge in defiance of Cambridge's ban on female admittance in the late 1800s. In the 1890s, Girton began a big push to have the courses that the women there were doing actually recognized by Cambridge, because they were doing equivalent work to what male Cambridge students were doing, but the women weren't allowed to earn degrees. They basically, they would come and get an education and then just go, and there wasn't any formal recognition. They didn't hold a bachelor's degree or whatever it was. And so there was a push, again, because the women were doing equivalent courses and were earning the same types of grades that the men at Cambridge proper were earning. So there was a big push to get those courses recognized. And that's a big part of the focus of Blue Stockings. Blue Stockings, for those of you who don't know that reference, this was a term developed in the late Victorian period, late 1800s, for sort of a broad catch-all term for women who pursued an education, women who, often women who were suffragettes, though not necessarily, and that's one of the big tensions in this play, but women who sort of believed in women's rights and women's equality within the public sphere. To whatever extent this was true, they were stereotyped as wearing blue stockings as some sort of symbol of independence. So the women of Girton were labeled blue stockings. They were associated with this movement of women who wanted equality, wanted opportunities for education and to pursue science and medicine and to develop knowledge, etc., etc. And this was very, very contentious in the late 1800s. And we actually get, in the prologue of Act 1, we get a good sense of that because we have Dr. Maudsley, who's just called Dr. Maudsley in the play. I don't know what his first name was. Presumably he had one. So Dr. Maudsley, a renowned psychologist, basically opens with a lecture to the undergraduates of Cambridge about why education was damaging for women. And this was very commonly a very commonly held belief at the time, especially in England, in the UK. People in continental Europe were actually moving a bit more toward acknowledging that intelligence is not distributed based on gender. So people like Freud and some of the other thinkers of France, Germany, Austria, places like this, were actually starting to say, hey, all of these traditional beliefs about women's inability to think, or the damage that it can do to women if they think critically and scientifically about the world, there's not really any evidence for them. And that's important because, again, we start with Maudsley, who gives us this lecture about how damaging knowledge is to not just women's minds, but also to their bodies as well. This idea that, like, oh, women only have a finite amount of energy, and so if they spend it on knowledge, then it'll destroy their reproductive abilities, or some bullshit like this, like completely unscientific, unfounded assumptions. And we actually get that later. We have a section where Maudsley is doing another talk at Cambridge, and the women of Girton have been invited, sort of. They're there, not really with Maudsley's approval, but they are there. And one of the women challenges him. Like, she points to Freud, she points to Charcot, she points to these people from the continent who are doing actual tests, actual studies of things like learning, things like critical thinking and women's psychology, and are disproving this idea that women are inherently unable to do higher education. And Maudsley gets infuriated, and he calls this girl, Tess, out, and basically claims that she's becoming hysterical because she can't handle critical thought. And Tess is like, why won't you acknowledge competing theories for which there is substantial evidence? And Maudsley just refuses to do this. So we have this combination in this case of sort of old school, I am the master in this sphere, this is my discipline, I am the authority, you will listen and not question, with this virulent and somewhat ugly misogyny. So that's one of the big components of the play. And actually, as it gets closer toward the end of the play to when the Cambridge board, or whatever it is, are going to vote on whether or not the women of Girton will be able to take degrees, we get increasingly ugly misogyny, up to the point where there's actually sort of a riot toward the end of the play where a bunch of men burn in effigy a blue stocking, a woman. So they make an effigy of a woman on a bicycle with blue stockings. They light it on fire. They actually come down to Girton and like break the windows and come in and basically threaten the women, etc., etc. So we've got that element. But I actually think in some ways the misogyny element is less interesting in this play. I think what's more interesting is the women's own challenges and attempts to define what they are doing. Because, I mean, as the men in the play refer to, Cambridge has centuries of history. There's like 800 years of tradition behind Cambridge by this point. Girton is brand new. The idea of higher education for women is brand new in the UK. And so the question becomes, what are they doing and what will be the outcomes of it? Is this going to destroy these women's ability to get married if that's what they want to do? Is this going to create an opportunity for them to have careers in the public sphere or whatever it is? How are they understanding what they're trying to achieve? That's a central question here, and I think it's really, really important and really, really interesting. So one of the things, we get this idea, this question of what are they doing and why, who are they becoming, right from the beginning. So Act 1, Scene 1, after the prologue, where Maudsley does his bullshit, we get this bit called The Laws of Motion. And the stage directions start by saying, outside on the forecourt of Girton College, Tess arrives looking self-conscious. She wears a makeshift bicycle outfit, large bloomers with stockings exposed. Now that's important because in the late 1880s, and especially into the 1890s, there was this phenomenon called the New Woman. And this was actually kind of aligned with the Blue Stockings movement, although the New Woman was a more positive term, whereas Blue Stockings tended to be a derogatory term. One of the symbols of the New Woman was bloomers. So bloomers in the 1890s, they were these very large, like almost MC Hammer type pants that came down to around the calf area. The reason that they were invented, actually, was so that women could ride bicycles. Because you can't, traditionally women in the Victorian era wore very, very large skirts, like 5-foot wide skirts. You can't bike in it. Impossible to ride a bike in a crinoline, in a 5-foot wide skirt with a ton of layers of stuff underneath it. You can't do it. But the New Women embraced the bicycle, and they embraced bloomers. And this was a scandalous fashion at the time, because even though, there was a massive amount of fabric still, so it kind of looked almost like a crinoline, kind of looked almost like those big dresses, but it was very distinctly pants. And so the New Women embraced this as a symbol of sort of emancipation from the dress as such. And they also embraced the bicycle as a symbol of modernity and of equality, because this was the first sport, the first physical activity that men and women did together. And so we have the women of Girton College coming out in the first act and scene dressed in the uniform of the New Woman. And if we know that context, it shows us this revolutionary quality of what they were doing, because the New Woman was emancipated in some ways. She participated in public life in a way that women in the Victorian period traditionally did not. They were interested in science, in knowledge. They often smoked, which traditionally women didn't do, either smoked pipes or cigarettes, which were actually kind of invented for women originally. And again, they bicycled. They were public women in a way that there just hadn't been in the past. And then Mr. Banks, who's one of the lecturers at Cambridge, who puts his reputation on the line and actually loses his job later in the play because he comes to teach part-time, basically, at Girton College. In this first scene, Mr. Banks brings out a bicycle and teaches them fundamentals of laws of motion through the action of the bicycle. And again, the bicycle was a sort of symbol of the New Woman in the same way that bloomers were. So we've got these very early signs that these are emancipated women trying to redefine their place in society. But this question keeps coming up, this idea of what are we doing and why, and what will be the consequences of it. So Tess, as Mr. Banks is trying to get her to ride this bicycle, says, "Sir, I don't think it's ladylike to exert yourself." And Mr. Banks says, "You're not ladies now, Moffat, you're scientists." So this is part of this idea, is these are women who genuinely are pursuing knowledge, but can they be women and scientists? And it's a difficult question to parse for them. Later, Miss Blake, who teaches moral philosophy, which is basically a sort of combination of ethics, aesthetics, art, etc., says, she gives them this really difficult assignment. This is an assignment super tough. Sets the bar really, really, really high. for them to think critically and to develop a massive base of knowledge very, very rapidly. And she says, "You know the men won't marry you if you choose knowledge." And she pauses and says, "And I won't lecture you if you don't." So this becomes sort of the stakes of this is, do you choose knowledge? Do you choose to be a blue stocking and pursue the life of the mind? Or do you retreat from knowledge into the more socially acceptable position of housewife, mother, society figure, people who had very little need for or access to formal scientific or philosophical knowledge, but who were materially probably much more comfortable than the women of Girton are likely to be if they can't marry and can't make their way in society. Now, the cool thing about this, the women of Girton College do choose knowledge, basically. I mean, they are going to university in a time where they could not generally go to university. It was an extremely unusual thing. And what I think is really, really cool, ultimately they end up pursuing knowledge. It is sort of the climax of the play. But one of the things that's really cool, Act 2, Scene 10, so fairly late in the play, we get this scene where Collins and Radley, who are two of the instructors at Cambridge, are looking over the essays that the Girton students have written. And the fucking work that these women have done is like amazingly good. Like, it's really, really interesting for me. Like, I don't want to be overly critical of my students here in the US, but like the work these women are doing is definitely equivalent to the kind of super high level work that Cambridge undergrads would have been doing in the 1890s. Like, one woman is defending a 17-year-old Einstein's thesis that Newton and Galileo were wrong, and she's doing it by charting like star movements and stuff like this. Another of these students is like, yeah, icebergs don't drift with the prevailing winds. We can look at this evidence and chart specific forces that act on icebergs other than wind that will give us a better sense of where they drift. And she's like, the way that I could test this is by getting on a boat and going out to the Atlantic and measuring it. And they're like, Collins is like, this research is expensive. Could you justify it? And Caroline, who's making this argument, is like, absolutely. The safety of Atlantic crossings might depend on it. This is 1896. In 1912, about 15 years or so later, the Titanic sinks because it strikes an iceberg. Like, she is doing the kind of work to actually chart these things. It's just another woman, Tess, wants to work out the temperature of stars based on the ionization of the photosphere. Like, these are undergrads who are doing this incredibly, incredibly complex work. And again, it is fascinating for me as an educator in the US education system, which is a very democratized system. So that's worth keeping in mind. We have massively more students in university than would have ever possibly have gone to Cambridge in 1896. But like, the work that they're doing is like graduate students in the US would not necessarily be capable of doing some of this work. So this idea that like women are physiologically incapable of critical thought is just absolutely destroyed by the amazing quality of the work these women were doing at Girton College. But the other thing here The other big issue in terms of defining what they're doing is the question of women's suffrage, which is, of course, also gaining steam in the 1890s. There's a lot of dissent, especially between Mrs. Welsh and Miss Blake. Mrs. Welsh kind of runs Girton. Miss Blake is one of the leading instructors. There's a lot of disagreement about whether or not Girton should in any way be connected to the suffragettes. Mrs. Welsh is absolutely categorically against it because she believes that they need to move incrementally toward achieving the goal of getting Cambridge University to acknowledge Girton graduates. That's her entire objective. Miss Blake is much more along the lines of these things are interconnected. Yes, it's crucial to get recognition for the work that our students are doing, but it's also crucial that they be able to have a voice in their government, in the world that they live in. And so that's one of the interesting and important elements here is this sort of reformer's dilemma. Like, if you push too hard, if you get too political, you will invite a backlash. But at the same time, if you try and move slowly so that the establishment is comfortable, you don't achieve your goals. You don't achieve the larger objectives of equality and access to the public sphere. So that reformer's bind plays out a number of times here. And the last little bit I want to talk about is the ending. So we've got these two characters, Will and Tess, and they've sort of had kind of a relationship, but Tess was in love with another guy. Will was in love with her, so he had this kind of love triangle thing. The other guy goes off and he's like, well, my dad wants me to marry this other woman, so I'm going to. And Tess is all broken up about this. Will tries to comfort her, etc., etc. They finally end up being like, all right, Tess is not right now ready for another relationship. Will is going to wait for her. So they're settled. And we get this last bit. It says here, they embrace. There is an anthem and a triumphant song, Gaudeamus Igitur. I'm not saying that right, I'm sure. As they sing, the following script appears, and this is the bit I'm interested in, either by projection or on 3 banners that they hoist down from above. This is the resolution of the play. The Girton girls continued to match their male peers grade for grade. Eventually, the Senate succumbed to pressure and Cambridge awarded the women the right to graduate. It was 50 years later, in 1948.